What you're about to hear was originally published on the From This Day Forward podcast. As that podcast has been folded into this one, we're republishing the episode here on Northwoods Church Matters. We hope you enjoy it and are edified by it. God bless.
You're listening to Northwoods Church Matters, a podcast of Northwoods Church in Evansville, Indiana, where we discuss why the local church matters and things that matter to the local church. I'm your host, Matt Higgins. I'm here with our Women's Ministry Director and Student Ministry Assistant, Rachel Bland. And today we're talking about a hot parenting topic, which is sexting. If you have a teenager and they are connected to a phone, then likely they're going to be impacted by this at some point in time, whether they want to or not. And our goal today with this podcast really is to help you as a parent navigate through this. Let's start off and ask just the basic question. What is sexting?
At its simplest form, it's two words put together, sex and texting. More sophisticated definition of what sexting is, I would pull from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Sexting is the sending or distributing of nude or partially nude images. That sending or distributing can be held within like a phone, it could be on your computer, it could be via email even. You're sending or distributing, however that looks like, nude or semi-nude photos.
I recently heard of an example where two kids were sending stuff over a PlayStation to one another. And so any form of electronic sending of this type of sexual content or nude content qualifies as sexting. So how common is sexting among teenagers?
I think it just depends. You could see statistics that's like 99% of teenagers are sexting, and that's probably not true. But basically all of these different research, they're just pulling like a small group of people. And so I think it's hard for us to really say how many people, like from like a nationwide standpoint or even worldwide standpoint, are sexting, but it's happening, and we do need to know that.
Like you said, there's some statistics that say everybody's doing it, and then some statistics that say, well, hardly anybody's doing it.
Right.
I think the truth is in between that, yeah, there are a certain percentage of students that are going to do this. So why do teenagers sext one another? I think a lot of adults just don't get this.
Well, I think there's a ton of reasons.
Yeah.
To begin, sexting is super easy. It doesn't take a lot of time. It doesn't, well, I guess it could, depending on like the pose that I guess you wanted to send.
What filter you want to use.
Yeah, what filter or whatever. But it is everywhere. Like you can send a sext at any moment of any day, especially like what we were talking about earlier. If you have access to a phone, it's super easy.
Also, statistically, kids are having less sex nowadays. That the Gen Z generation is risk averse. There are problems that can come from having premarital sex, that there's risk of pregnancy, STD, and sexting seems like a safe way to sexually interact with your boyfriend, girlfriend, or somebody that you're interested in.
Also, it's a form of currency amongst teenagers. I've personally dealt with students who were doing it to trade for something. So like the way that this would work is a student would send a nude photo in exchange for alcohol, or a student would send a nude photo in exchange for drugs, or a student would send a nude photo in exchange for, and then you can fill in the blank.
And blackmail for that reason.
Yes, 100%. But I also think one of the big things is pressure. I think our students feel pressure to send a photo, and I don't necessarily think that they are looking at that as like a positive or a negative pressure. I just think that they see it as some sort of standard that they have to live up to. Get with their friends, or if like sports team, the majority of those people are all either receiving them or sending them. And so if you're the one that's not done that, then there's something wrong with you.
I think it's interesting that the acceptability of sexting is changing. That for my generation, for Gen Z or boomers or people that are older that did not grow up with phones or technology, we would never think of, okay, I'm going to take a nude picture of myself and send it to somebody. When I was Googling this in preparation for this podcast, I was expecting the first thing to come up on Google when I type in sexting would be articles about the dangers of sexting. Actually, I think the top hit when I Googled it was, I think, a Cosmo article about how you can be a better sexter to your partner. For younger generations, this is often just a normal part of dating nowadays.
Yeah.
That it's a step before actual sexual intercourse, that you are safely quote unquote, engaging with your partner on a sexual level with your phone before you actually take the dive into actually having sexual intercourse. So there's almost like a stage of sex that's added to the dating relationship.
And I think what you're saying goes to the topic of they think they love them. Like they think that we're in love. And so then the next step is to send a nude photo or whatever, because that's when you're at your most vulnerable.
So what are some apps that kids use to sex one another?
Oh, this is a laundry list.
And it's growing because how prevalent it is.
Yes, exactly. I think the obvious one is just the general like text messaging, like iMessage or text, like they can do that. However, that one's harder to hide because that one leaves some kind of a trail. But the one that most parents are probably most familiar are Snapchat, Instagram, TikTok is now becoming like, not only do you send a photo, but you're sending a video of yourself. You can do like the freeze frame, so you can literally create a video of you taking off your clothes. Such great stuff. Google can be really dangerous because you can open a Google Doc, like which looks like a regular gonna write a paper, but you can insert a photo, you can share that document with someone else, and then they can see the photo and then they can delete it for you type of thing. There's just a ton of ways to do it. And I think the scary part to me about all of this is that you can be the best parent in the whole world and your kid's gonna find a way to sext if they really want to do that. We can prep it and we can say, hey, watch out for Snapchat. Well, they're not going to use Snapchat because that's too obvious. They're going to get more creative.
Yeah. And, a thing that a lot of kids are using now is just doing this type of stuff over FaceTime or Skype or any type of video messaging type of thing because it doesn't leave a paper trail.
Right.
And kids inherently know the internet is forever. You don't want to send something to somebody that's permanent because it's often used for blackmail or nefarious type of purposes. It turns into pornography. And so they've worked around that. And so now it's gone to video stuff or content that is disappearing content. I mean, it really is scary how savvy that our kids are right now. If your kids are on Snapchat or TikTok, they are getting pressured to get involved in sexting. Now, that's the end of the story. And that's not to say that they shouldn't be on those things, but we've got to know that those things are used for that. And boys and girls alike are going to pressure other persons to get involved in this behavior.
And I think what you're saying about guys and girls is really important too, because I feel like there can be a little bit of a stereotype or like a gender role in this where we're like, oh, well, it's the guys who are pressuring the girls, or, the girls are the weaker vessel. And so they're less likely to do this. Everything as far as stereotypes when it comes to guys and girls and sexting is just toss it out the window because it's pretty equal both ways.
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of girls nowadays that are trying to initiate a relationship with a boy by sending them a semi-nude or nude photo. And it gets increasingly more provocative as the interest level continues. So what are some reasons why sexting is a bad idea? Before we get too far down the rabbit hole on this one, we got to remember that the real reason why kids sext is because they are sinful people. Romans 3:23 says that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And, our kids are sinners too. And even after our kids get saved, they have this struggle with their flesh, whether they should be walking with the Spirit or they should be following their flesh. And that struggle is daily. And it talks about it in Galatians 5 that these things are opposed to each other. The Spirit is opposed to the flesh and the flesh is opposed to the Spirit. And so we've got to remember that our kids are going to make mistakes and they're going to commit sins. They're just going to commit things that are blatantly sinful and do things that are blatantly wrong. But on top of that, we've got to remember that this whole category of sexting falls under the category of lust. When it talks about in Matthew chapter 5, when Jesus says that anyone who looks at a woman with lustful eyes has already committed adultery in his heart, that looking at somebody lustfully, that's already adultery. And we don't want to overlook the seriousness of this, that it's not just a playful thing or a relationship thing. It is actually a violation against what God calls us to do and how he wants us to live. And so now that we've kind of got that out of the way, what are some other reasons why sexting is a bad idea, Rachel?
Well, I think we should cover the legal stuff first. In the past, it's been deemed as child pornography. If you're sending it, if you're distributing it, this is child pornography. And that was true up until about 3 years ago. And then that law changed. And so now it's called indecent display by a youth. And it is still a crime. Like let me make that very clear. It's not considered child pornography, but this is a crime still. It's a misdemeanor, which means that potentially there could be an investigation. At its worst, there could be some sort of jail time. The specifics on that, I'm not super clear on, but you can literally Google Indiana indecent display by a youth. And then you can read all about exactly what the law says. I mean, this is serious stuff. And on a, heart level, emotionally, you don't know where that picture can go. You don't know who's going to look at it. And so if you were the vulnerability of sending a nude photo is exactly like, I think of in Genesis 3, you have Adam and Eve standing and naked, and they were feeling the shame that was there whenever they weren't supposed to be exposed. And so now we're living in a world where we are doing that exposure consistently. Like if you can follow a trail of how a photo can be sent, then that one photo that was sent to one person could not only, let's just say it's never sent to anybody else, but that one person shows it to everyone, and then everyone starts laughing or talking or making jokes about whatever that photo was. That could lead to embarrassment or bullying. And when we play this all out, it could lead to suicide. And I know we don't like to throw those words around because they're buzzwords, but there's some genuine truth behind all of this, that one sext could lead to suicide just because we can't control. Like when you send it out, you have no clue what can happen to it. Let's say the fake Instagram profiler starts reaching out to your kid, and your kid starts to get, in essence, targeted to send a nude photo. Then they're like, oh my gosh, that's a really pretty picture. I really like him or her. And then they send a photo to them. And then you find out that the person behind the profile was someone at school who just wanted to make fun of me. Or maybe it's not a person at school. Maybe it's someone even worse who is distributing child pornography, who's staging as a high school boy or girl to get nude photos of young girls or young boys. It could be a 60-year-old dude. You just don't know who's behind these profiles, and you don't know what they can do with the photo. I mean, it's like, this is scary stuff.
It is.
That's why there's law behind it. One of the other things that we often, I think, kind of forget about, because when we're talking about why is this bad, we obviously talk about the law, we can talk about the emotional issues, but I also think that there's consequences that guys and girls don't think about that happen on a school level as well. As a teacher, when I was teaching middle school, we had students who were kicked off, basketball teams. We had kids who were suspended for like 3 weeks, and then they had to go to alternative school for a little bit. I mean, there are some serious ramifications, and that happened. And we called it the sexting ring when I was teaching, because there was literally a ring of people that were all involved in this. And then I think when you take this to another level, we live so close to Kentucky or so close to Illinois or so close to Ohio even, that not only these laws that we're talking about happen at the state level. So if your picture were to start crossing lines to other states, which that sounds bigger because we don't often think like that, but I guarantee you most of our students, even here at Northwoods, know friends that live in Kentucky, Illinois, or Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
They just know people in the surrounding states. If they were to send that photo across state borders, that's a whole different ballgame of what their state law says about sexting and child pornography or this indecent display by a youth. It just gets super, super, super muddy.
Yeah. And just to clarify one thing in the law too, is that the moment that you take a picture of yourself and you are nude or semi-nude, you have committed an act of indecent exposure or child pornography or whatever the applicable law is. So even if you never share it with anybody, and the fact that you've taken that photo and it's on your phone, that's an illegal act if you are under 18. If you simply receive it, you did not solicit it. You didn't say, hey, send nudes or whatever to the girl down the block. You have received an unsolicited picture. And if you keep that picture and don't tell anybody that you have that picture, you're involved with indecent exposure or child pornography, whatever the applicable law is. People often don't think about that. They think about the boy that's actively soliciting nude pictures, or the kid on some sort of team that they're sharing photos with one another. If you simply take a picture, you're involved. So now that we've effectively scared the daylights out of everybody, and people without children are saying, I'm never having children.
Exactly.
And people with children are saying, I'm going to lock my kid in their room until they're 18 and then let them out. Here's a question that I get asked all the time. Should teenagers have phones and devices at all? And is the act of giving kids a phone just like opening Pandora's box?
I think it just depends on the parent. I think you're going to look at it because there's pros and cons to any means of technology. Whether if your kid has a device of any nature, iPod, iPad, computer, PlayStation, like we talked about, Xbox, whatever, you have to recognize the risk with anything. Yeah. And so to just say like, well, should they have a phone or not? I don't know. Like, what, you're the parent, you decide, like this is highly debated. I think you're going to have to just be able to have conversations with your kids. But I also think that if you're the parent and you're listening to this and your kid does have an iPod and iPad and Xbox and a PlayStation, why are you not giving them a phone? Like you have to be able to recognize the risks are pretty much the same no matter what the device is. So I think really the question should be not should my kid have a phone, but should my kid have access to the internet?
Yeah, that's a bigger picture. Like PlayStations and tablets and things like that, you can still access the internet.
Yeah. I've heard this said multiple times. To have a driver's license, for example, you have to have driver's ed. You have to learn how to operate the car. It's under supervision. You have to have classes as learning the law behind all of the different signs, what happens if you don't pull over, what all of these different things. There's class to show you how to do that. I think the internet should be the same way. Like if you have to have a license to drive a car, I think in some sense you can think about it like you have to have a license to get on the internet. It's just as dangerous as driving a moving vehicle, if not more deadly. And I think we have to recognize that you are putting yourself and others at risk by using the internet. And so that leads, we need to be educating our students on how to do this. So I know that doesn't really answer your question. I think you just have to be cautious. What do you guys do?
I'll take a swing at that question, which is I don't think it's parental malpractice to give your kids a phone. Anything in all of creation that God has given us can be used for God's glory or for sinful purposes.
Right.
And phones are the same as anything else. You give a kid a phone, and if they are a lost kid, it's probably they are going to use that phone for an illegitimate or sinful purpose at some point in time. Just the simple act of giving a kid a phone is not a sinful thing. Now, what is parental malpractice is saying, okay, here's free range to a device that has access to the internet, and I'm never going to check up on you. I'm never going to put in any controls. I'm never going to parent well. You give a kid a phone, you've got to parent more because you've given them responsibility like we talked about a car. And so we've got to engage with our kids about what they're doing on the phone. What we've done with our child is we've monitored. We've had filters on the internet. We check up behind her on what she does. And sometimes she thought she was very sleuthy, and it turns out the old people knew more about the internet than she thought, caught some things, and we've had some good discussions. She's grown into a better Christian by giving trust and reeling out trust slowly to her. One thing that we've done is we've limited social media very intentionally. We told her up front, we are not going to let you have social media, period, until you're in high school. And when you're in high school, you can have one social media site. The end. Some debates about that and some pressure to give in on that, but we followed the rules, and I think that it's worked out well. What I think is just bad as a parent is saying, here's a phone. You can access any apps you want. You can have anything you want on the phone. That is parental malpractice. You've got to parent more when your kids have phones. So congratulations.
Yeah. And I think too, just like kind of adding into what you're saying, I think that like slowly giving them that responsibility and teaching them like one step at a time of like how to operate a phone is wise. Like if we just decided, okay, like no phones, like if that was the new rule, like if we're just not going to give any kid any phones, but then once they graduate and they go off to college, we bless them with a phone, then they're learning for the first time. Granted, they'll probably get insight from their friends, but they themselves have personal access to all of these tools for the first time without supervision. And that's probably not how you want them to be exposed to worldly things for the first time. So I do think if you can do something gradually, then that would be helpful. Even if they started, I don't think there's anything wrong with the flip phone. I did hear that flip phones were like crazy more expensive than like the iPhone, which just blows my mind. But I mean, like, you know, you could literally start them off with like a flip phone. You'd have to be willing to pay the price, right? But
you can still get them.
Yeah. I think middle school is probably the average, I would say, time to get a phone just because there are more extracurricular activities. It's a little annoying to have your kid borrow someone else's phone or to wait after school and have, you know, call your mom or whatever. And so I would say middle school is probably a good like time to get a phone. And then just like you said, gradually giving them the freedom of what internet and on a phone looks like. But then like have those rules before you start giving them out.
Yeah. Or a contract.
Yeah. Like a contract. That would be really good. And then you can, that way your kids just kind of know, okay, well, I'm not at that point in my life and that's okay.
Yeah. I think the car illustration is, to bring that in again, is routinely we do things with our kids that say, until you're mature enough, you can't have this. And driving is one of those things. And then as they get it, they slowly build up trust. We don't immediately give somebody the keys to a car and say, okay, drive to Vincennes today. As they build up trust, then we let them drive more places. But with phones, for some reason, parents don't do this. There is an age where our kids are responsible enough to handle the internet. And I'm not going to sit here on the podcast and say it's got to be this age or that age, because every kid's maturity is different.
Right.
There are some kids in high school that have no business having a phone because they're idiots. And then there are kids in middle school. They are super mature and they can handle that responsibility. So even in your household, you may have different children with different levels of maturity, and you just can't set a certain rule as to the kids at 13, they're able to get a phone. You may have to have different standards for different kids and just simply say to your child, okay, you've done X, Y, and Z, and you haven't earned trust with us. You need to do some things in order to build up trust in order to get a phone.
They're meeting those different mile markers.
Yeah, different mile markers. Thank you, Miss Bland. What can parents do to protect their kids from sexting?
I think the obvious one that we've mentioned a bunch is just educate, period. Communicate with them and talk through like what's the good, the bad, the ugly. And I do think that like if you were to do the gradual level, like we've been talking about, then that conversation starts before they even have a phone. That conversation is, you know, it's like the driver's ed class. Like you're having a phone ed class and you're talking them through like all of the good, all of the bad. They don't have access to that car yet though. They don't have access to the phone yet, but we're giving them all of the information that they may need. And if you need help on how to start that conversation, National Center of Missing and Exploited Children, they have tons of great resources. I was actually just telling Matt about that before we started recording. They have little videos on there too, which could be kind of cheesy, but if you wanted to start explaining phone rules to your elementary age kids, then go for it. I mean, elementary age kids are using the internet as well for school. So it's good for them to start getting in good practice and good habits on how to use the internet, what we do on the internet. But I also think educating them on not only what sexting is, like you want them to hear that word from you first.
Yeah.
Before they hear it from a friend, before they hear the word nude from a friend, you should be the one that tells them those words first.
Yeah. I mean, if you're not telling your middle schoolers about what sexting is or what porn is, that's irresponsible. I mean, who do you want your kids to hear this stuff from? You or somebody else? I mean, I've had high schoolers in church before. We talk about pornography and they're like, what is pornography? You have got to tell your kids about this stuff before they encounter it, because they are going to encounter it.
And I think the scary part, I think sometimes for parents, I've heard this before, is like, I don't want to take away the innocence of my child. And I totally respect that. Like, I hear that. Like, I get that. But I also think that it's going to be taken from them, not from you, so to speak. And you don't want that. And so I think being proactive and having that conversation, this is an ongoing, it's a progressive conversation. Like we're talking about maybe newer and worser things as the conversation's progressing. You're going to talk to your, let's say maybe 8-year-old, because I think the average age of even students looking at porn or whatever now is like 8 or 10 or something like that.
Yeah, it's very low.
It's a wild number. And so I think it's important to have those conversations starting at an earlier age and then progressing that conversation just as it goes on. I think the other thing that you have to remember as a parent is that you're the one probably paying for the phone. And so if you're trying to protect your kids from sexting. Matt mentioned this earlier with his kid. You're allowed to set parental controls. You're allowed to set internet blocks or whatever at your home. You're the one paying for the phone. It's yours. So remember that.
Yeah. I do hear this often, that parents often say, well, I don't want to harm the innocence of my child. Christ calls us as Christians to be shrewd. There's that whole parable of the dishonest manager or the shrewd manager, where at the end of the parable, we are called to be shrewd and savvy in the midst of a world full of wolves. We have to make sure that as shepherds of our kids, that our kids aren't eaten by the wolves. That's a good goal for us as parents. Mm-hmm. And we have to guide our kids well. Just like as a pastor, my goal is to guard the flock well and to protect them from harm. The same thing goes for our kids.
Let them hear the truth from you first. That way, when lies of you need to do this because I'm pressuring you into doing this, or you need to be like everybody else on the team and get a nude photo, that's a lie that they're hearing. And then because they're comparing that to the truth of what they've heard from you, hopefully as the parent, they can go, that's not right.
Yeah.
And then they can pick that out. Then you really are, in some sense, protecting their innocence. It just looks different than telling your kid about sex and nude photos and all of that stuff than what you originally thought.
Yeah. And this is a topic that I really want to address on the podcast a lot. And we're going to be having a future podcast just on the topic of sex, and then have one on pornography as well. But I think that as we teach our kids, we've got to make sure that we aren't perpetuating the lie that sex is dirty. And instead of saying, well, these things are dirty and you shouldn't do them, that God created sex for husband and wife, that it is a good thing, but it's meant for the context of marriage, and it's meant not to share. And so for our future spouse, we keep these things private between us. And it's not necessarily a dirty thing when it happens in the context of marriage. It's a good thing. There are lots of passages in the Old Testament about delighting in the beauty of your wife forever. And so you're supposed to delight in your spouse, not anybody else. And that's a good thing. When you get married, delight all you want and go for it.
That's right.
Yeah. Amen to that. So what do you do if you catch your kids sexting?
Okay, so I divided this up into 3 different categories. So I said, like, practically, there's a conversation you need to have. Emotionally, there's a conversation that needs to be had. And spiritually, there needs to be a conversation about that too. Practically, if your kid is caught sexting, whether they're the sender or the receiver, there are different things that you should do. So, for example, if your child has sent a photo, to immediately report the image. That way, if it is online, then people can come alongside and recognize that this is an image that wasn't meant to be there. And then the social media higher power of authority can then hopefully get it offline. So if you're the sender and you've used some sort of, again, social media website to do that, make sure you're reporting it. And there's a detailed outline list of how to do this on every single app on that National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. I know I keep saying that over and over again. Look at the website. It's got tons and tons and tons of resources on it. So if you're the sender, make sure that you are reporting that image. But if you receive a photo, especially like unwarranted, like you didn't want it, you definitely need to talk to your parents, encourage that conversation. I think that goes back to the importance of having that open conversation, open dialogue between parents and their students. Because then a student will say, hey, mom, hey, dad, someone sent me a nude photo today. And don't freak out by that if they do.
Don't freak out.
If they do tell you that, be calm, be cool. It's okay. Remember, you're not the first one engaging in this and probably won't be the last. And so encourage your student, especially if they're in public school or even if they're in private school, to show the school administrator. And that's kind of a scary thing for a middle schooler. It's a scary thing for a high schooler. But the reason for that is if there is that photo being traced and it's on your kid's phone, it can be wiped so that they're not held criminally liable for it. And so I think it's important for your kid to know that whenever they're going to the school and they're saying, hey, I received a nude photo or whatever, then they're telling the administrators so that the administrators can have the police come in, which sounds even scarier, to wipe the photo. And that's for your kids' protection. Like, I know that anytime we start talking about the police getting involved, it's like, well, it's like you automatically think there's an investigation. Again, police are not bad, scary people. They're there to help protect us. Practically speaking, I think it's good letting them know, hey, if you do ever send a photo and you were just doing it in a moment, please come tell me. That way we can report the image and it doesn't get shared across all of these different things. But at the same time, if they are the receiver of it, again, communicating that on the front end, not on the back end, because if you do it after, it's almost too late because you're having to have all of these really difficult conversations after the act has already been done. And so practically speaking, obviously talk about it. But I think if you catch them in it, you're going to have to start with a conversation. And that's the not fun part. But I also think that that practical stuff can kind of hit the back burner sometimes, because sometimes you may be finding out as the parent, my kid sent a nude photo, because you're getting a phone call from the school saying, hey, your kid sent a nude photo. And in that instance, I think that's kind of that like hard moment as a parent, because then there's so many emotions coming in. And my biggest encouragement to you would just be to remember that you're not alone. You're not the first parents whose kids are found
for sure
with a sext. And so I think that's where, as believing parents, we can love our kids well, even when they make mistakes. And I think that's where the emotional conversation and the spiritual conversation can kind of go hand in hand, because I genuinely believe that at the root of all of this, I think that there's a reason. Mm-hmm. And I think that you as a parent have this really cool, which doesn't sound cool at the time, but you really do have this really cool opportunity to get to know your kid's heart, maybe in a completely new way. If you do catch your kids in the act, or not just in the act, but on the post end of it, and they have done it, I would just say love, 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 and then show them an immense amount of grace, an immense amount of forgiveness. And I know that there are those students out there who are just sorry that they got caught, and they're just going to continue doing it. But I think the best thing that we can do is to continue to show them Jesus and to continue to share the gospel with them. I think our brains automatically as parents go, I'm taking away your phone. You can never have this again. Those are good things. Like, that's a good reaction. There should be consequences. But I think sometimes like the mistake that gets made is that we go so far into practical that we forget about the emotional spiritual. And I would argue that emotional spiritual is more important than practical, because if the heart is not taken care of, if our heart before the Lord is not taken care of, I'm just going to continue to do it and continue to do it and continue to do it no matter what. And that's the hard part.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes in parenting, it feels like we want to push the easy button a lot. And the easy button for this situation is they're never going to have a phone again, and we're just going to throw it all out, and we're never going to trust them again. I think that's a mistake to not give your kids a way to build trust somehow, because that's going to put your kid in just a horrible frame of mind that my parents don't trust me at all, and they'll never trust me again. I mean, that's just a crummy feeling to have. And I think that as parents, how we react to our kids' first crisis will determine the course of what happens with the next crisis.
Right.
That if our kids come to us and say, hey, this has happened, and they get to the point of courage of talking to us about something, and if we fly off the handle and take away everything and lock them in the room for 1,000,000 days and ground them forever from all devices, they're going to say to themselves, well, I'm not going to talk to my parents again, because they see the result. Go back to that verse in Proverbs, other places throughout Scripture where it talks about delighting in the wife of your youth. God intended sex to be good. He intended for us to delight in our partner throughout our lifetime. And what a offense to that verse if in our dating life we are delighting in other people. It's almost like we are robbing our future spouse of the delight that they deserve. Save it for marriage. When it's in marriage, go forth and delight in it, because it is good. And God intended it to be good. And that's what we need to teach our kids. Thanks for tuning in to the Northwoods Church Matters podcast. If you'd like to find out more about Northwoods Church, you can visit us at our website, www.northwoodschurch.org. Again, that's www.northwoodschurch.org.